Can a prophecy be silenced by death? How could the last words of an old woman shatter a kingdom? Where does true power lie? In the sharpness of a sword, or the truth hidden between whispers? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The cold of the dungeon was not the clean chill of winter, but a damp, clinging foulness that seeped into the bones and festered there. It was the cold of forgotten places, of despair given physical form. In the flickering light of a single, guttering torch, the shadows danced like specters on the wet stone walls of the cell. Morwenna, the woman they called the Stone Witch, did not feel the cold anymore. At 85, her body was a map of wrinkles and frail limbs, a vessel long emptied of earthly comforts. But her eyes, pale and sharp as flint, held a fire that the damp and the darkness could not quench. She sat on the bare stone floor, her back not against the wall, but a few inches from it, as if in silent communion with the rock itself. The heavy iron door groaned open. It screeched, tearing through the silence. 2 guards in the livery of King Valerius entered, their faces hard and impersonal. Between them strode the king himself. King Valerius was a man in his 50s, but the weight of a crown stolen through blood and the constant fear of losing it had carved deep grooves of paranoia into his face. He wore rich furs and velvet, a stark, absurd contrast to the squalor around him. He looked at Morwenna not as a person, but as a problem to be solved, a stubborn stain on his reign. Which, he spat, the word echoing in the small space. They tell me you still refuse to speak. You have eaten my bread for a decade in this hole. Your silence is a poor repayment for my mercy. Morwenna's lips, thin and cracked, twitched into something that was not quite a smile. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rustle, like dead leaves scraping against stone, yet it carried an unnerving clarity. You call this mercy, Valerius? You call the slow theft of light, the constant kiss of damp, the company of rats mercy. You have your father's talent for twisting words. She paused, letting the reference to the king he had murdered hang in the air. But you did not come for conversation. You come because you are afraid. The whispers in the court have grown too loud for you to ignore. You want the prophecy. The king's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He took a step closer, his boots scuffing the filthy straw. I want the truth you have been hiding. For years you have muttered about a true heir, one who would rise from the stones. Is it a pretender in the mountains? A bastard child across the sea? Tell me who threatens my throne. A genuine, low chuckle escaped Morwenna's throat. It was a sound that held no mirth, only a bottomless well of ancient knowledge and pity. You see armies and assassins. You think the threat to a rotten tree comes from the storm outside, when it is the worm within that seals its fate. You cannot fight a truth, Valerius. You can only delay its coming. Enough of your riddles, the king roared, his voice cracking with frustration. He leaned down, his face close to hers, the scent of wine and fear on his breath. My seers are useless, their visions clouded. My spies find nothing. Only you, they say. Only the stone which sees the unraveling of my line. I will have the name. Now. Morwenna met his gaze, her flinty eyes unwavering. The stones do not speak in names, boy. They speak in ages. In the turning of the world, the heir is not a who you can hunt, but a what that is already in motion. A reckoning. Valerius straightened up, his face a mask of cold fury. You leave me no choice. I have been patient. I have been civil. But your obstinacy is treason. If you will not serve your king with your sight, you will serve him as an example. He turned to the guards. Bring the executioner's block to the square at dawn. Let the people see what becomes of those who defy their king. The guards nodded, their expressions grim. As Valerius turned to leave, his cloak swirling in the damp air, Morwenna spoke again, her voice dropping to a prophetic whisper that seemed to slither from the very stones. You seek to silence the echo by shattering the bell, Valerius. But the sound has already fled. It is in the air. It is in the heart of the kingdom you think you rule. My death will not stop it. It will be the first note of its crescendo. The king paused at the door, his shoulders tense. He did not look back. The heavy door slammed shut, plunging the cell back into near darkness. The king's threat and Morwenna's warning locked in the stagnant air together. For a long time, Morwenna did not move. The silence settled back, heavier now, pregnant with the promise of the dawn. Then a different sound, a soft scraping from a small, high grate in the wall, broke the stillness. A hidden panel, cleverly concealed between the stones, slid inward. A figure, shrouded in a dark, hooded cloak, slipped silently into the cell. The visitor knelt before Morwenna, pushing back the hood to reveal the pale, beautiful, and deeply weary face of Queen Lyra. Her eyes, usually so guarded in the public eye, were wide with fear and a desperate hope. "You heard?" Morwenna asked, her voice softening by a fraction. "Every word," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. She pulled a small wax paper package from her cloak, a piece of soft cheese and a strip of dried meat, then a small vial of a milky, opiate liquid for the pain that constantly gnawed at the old woman's joints. "He means to do it. At dawn. He has no other path left to walk," Morwenna said, accepting the offerings with a nod of gratitude. "His fear has blinded him to all others." "What can I do?" Lyra's question was a plea. "I am a bird in a gilded cage. I have no power, no army." "You have more than you know, child," Morwenna said, fixing the young queen with her intense gaze. "You are the key. The lock is turning. When the sun rises and the crowd gathers, you must be ready." "Ready for what?" Lyra asked, her brow furrowed in confusion and fear. Morwenna reached out a skeletal hand and gently touched the queen's abdomen, a gesture of startling intimacy and profound meaning. "The stones do not lie, Lyra. The true heir is not a specter from the past. It is the promise of the future. It is the seed that has already taken root. Your time of hiding is nearly over. Your time of strength is coming." She leaned closer, her whisper barely audible, yet it seemed to shake the very foundations of the dungeon. "When the rope touches my neck, do not weep. Watch, listen, for in my end, your true reign will begin. Now go, and be brave." A mixture of terror, awe, and dawning understanding washed over Lyra's face. She pulled her hood up, her movements swift and silent, and disappeared back through the hidden passage, leaving Morwenna alone in the darkness. The old woman slowly leaned back, her spine finally making contact with the cold, unforgiving stone of the wall. A true, serene smile touched her lips for the first time. She closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in focus. She could feel the immense, slow heartbeat of the mountain upon which the castle was built. She could feel the countless stones that formed its walls, its foundations, its very soul. They were her children, her confidants, her weapons. The plan, woven over decades of patient suffering, was finally reaching its endgame. The king saw only an old woman he was about to kill. He did not see the catalyst. He did not see that her death was not a defeat, but the final, necessary ingredient for a prophecy written not on parchment, but in the very bedrock of the kingdom. Dawn was coming, and with it, the stone would speak. What gives a prophecy its power? Is it the words themselves, or the belief of those who hear them? Can the death of one frail woman truly shake the foundations of a kingdom? We witnessed the end of Morwenna, but was it an end or a beginning? Tell us what you believe in the comments. Dawn did not break over the capital so much as it seeped into the sky, a slow, gray stain pushing back the night. A thick, cold mist had rolled in from the river, muffling sounds and cloaking the city in a spectral shroud. It was a day for ghosts and whispers. The main square, usually a bustling hub of commerce and life, was unnervingly quiet. A crowd had gathered, but it was a somber, watchful mass of people. There were no jeers, no thrown-rotten fruit. There was only a tense, fearful anticipation. They had come to see the stone which die. On a raised wooden platform, stark against the gray morning, stood the executioner's block. It was a simple, brutal thing, its dark wood stained with the history of its grim purpose. The executioner himself, a hulking figure in a black hood, stood motionless beside it, his heavy axe resting on his shoulder. King Valerius observed from a protected balcony overlooking the square. He was flanked by his personal guard and the gaunt, severe figure of High Priest Caius, whose eyes held a fervent, approving light. This was not just an execution. It was a purification and a message. Queen Lyra stood slightly behind her husband, her face a pale, beautiful mask of stoic composure, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the stone balustrade, and beneath her heavy robes, she could feel a faint, fluttering tremor, a secret she now carried, a truth that made the coming moment both terrifying and sacred. The heavy tramp of boots echoed in the silence. 2 guards emerged from the dungeon gate, leading Morwenna between them. She looked even more fragile in the open air, a wisp of a woman dwarfed by the armored men. Yet, she walked with a dreadful dignity, her head held high, her flinty eyes scanning the crowd without fear. She did not look at the block, nor at the king. She seemed to be looking through them all, at something only she could see. A murmur rippled through the crowd as she was led up the steps to the platform. The executioner stepped forward, his movements efficient and impersonal. He took her by the arm, his grip firm, and guided her to kneel before the block. The rough-hewn wood grain was inches from her face. This was the moment Valerius had waited for, the moment of submission, the silencing of the thorn in his side. The executioner positioned her head. He reached for the thick hempen rope, not to bind her, but as a final, symbolic gesture of control before the axe fell. He looped it around her thin, wrinkled neck, a mockery of a noose. And that was when Morwenna smiled. It was not a smile of defiance, nor of madness. It was a smile of profound, unsettling fulfillment. A smile that held a secret too vast for the square to contain. Her voice, when it came, did not cry out. It did not plead. It was that same dry, rustling whisper, yet it carried on the misty air with impossible clarity, reaching every corner of the silent square, echoing up to the king's balcony. "Finally," she said, and the word was like a key turning in a lock. "The true heir to the throne is born, and my death will be the first step of their coronation." For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. The proclamation hung in the air, a truth so audacious it seemed to stop time itself. Then King Valerius shot to his feet, his face a thundercloud of rage. "Do it. Now," he bellowed, his voice cracking. The executioner, startled from his grim routine, raised the heavy axe high. The polished steel caught a sliver of the weak, gray light. The axe fell. It was a clean, brutal strike. A collective gasp, a single exhalation of horror and pity, went up from the crowd. But what happened next would be seared into the memory of every witness, to be told and retold in hushed tones for generations. Morwenna's blood, dark and vital, did not just pool or drip. It flowed onto the wooden block, and then, as if guided by an unseen hand, it dripped onto the ancient, worn cobblestones of the square below the platform. And the stones, they drank it in, but not passively. Where the first drops fell, a faint, rust-colored pattern began to form. It was not a random stain. It spread, intricate and deliberate, like the unfurling of a petrified leaf or the tracing of a runic symbol. It was a sigil, a mark that pulsed with a faint, coppery light for a single, impossible moment before fading into the stone, now a permanent, bloody scar on the heart of the city. High above, Queen Lyra's hand flew to her mouth, not to stifle a scream, but to trap the sob of awe and terror that threatened to escape. "My death will be the first step." The words echoed in her mind. The step was now literally, bloodily, etched into the stone. The crowd, stunned into a deeper silence, began to back away, their superstitious fear a palpable force. The executioner stared at his axe, then at the marked stone, his confidence shattered. "Witchcraft," High Priest Caius hissed, his voice laced with venom and a sliver of fear. "A final trick, a blasphemy." But the king was not looking at the blood-stained stone. He was staring at his wife. He saw the pallor of her face, the hand pressed to her abdomen, the look in her eyes that was not just grief, but something else, something like recognition. A terrible, icy suspicion began to crystallize in his gut. Down in the square, as the guards moved to clear the platform and remove the body, A young woman lingered at the edge of the dispersing crowd. Alara, the daughter of the head jailer, had watched the entire spectacle with a heart pounding not just with horror, but with a fierce, inexplicable curiosity. She had often taken the old woman her meals, had been captivated by her quiet strength and the strange, ancient stories she would sometimes tell. While others fled the ominous symbol on the ground, Alara found herself drawn to it. She knelt, ignoring the dampness seeping through her dress, and traced the air just above the stained cobblestone. The pattern was unfamiliar, but it felt intentional. It felt like a message. Her eyes, sharp and accustomed to the shadows of the dungeon, then drifted from the square to the outer wall of the very dungeon Morwenna had called home for a decade. There, just beside the heavy gate, where the old woman's hand might have brushed against the stone countless times, something else was happening. The perpetual moisture on the moss-covered stones was shimmering, not with reflected light, but with a soft, internal, greenish luminescence. As Alara watched, transfixed, the shimmering moisture seemed to coalesce, forming lines and curves along the natural fissures of the rock. They were runes, faint, ethereal, and fading in and out of view, but unmistakable. The stone which was dead, but her voice was not silenced. It was whispering from the stones themselves, and Alara was the only one listening. The game was far from over. It had just begun. Where do we look for truth when the world is built on lies? In dusty books, in the words of the forgotten, or in the silent marks left on stone? Alara is about to find out that the most dangerous secrets are often the ones no one is looking for. What would you risk to uncover a hidden truth? Let us know in the comments. A pall of uneasy silence had fallen over the castle, thicker and more suffocating than the river mist. The execution was over, but Morwenna's final prophecy was very much alive. It was a ghost that walked the corridors, a murmur in the servants' quarters, a fear in the hearts of the nobles. King Valerius had doubled the guard and retreated into his council chambers, with High Priest Caius, their voices alow. Furious rumble behind closed doors. The message was clear. The incident in the square was to be forgotten, the blood-stained cobblestone scrubbed clean, until no trace remained. But some traces could not be so easily erased. In the dim, windowless confines of the dungeon's antechamber, Alara sat sharpening a dagger, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. Her father, the head jailer, paced before her, his face etched with worry. "You saw nothing, girl," he said, his voice gruff with forced authority. "Stones don't drink blood. Stones don't glow. It was a trick of the light, the ravings of a dying old woman. You will forget it." Alara looked up, her gaze steady. "The light doesn't write runes, father. I saw them, by the dungeon gate. They were calling." "Runes," he scoffed, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Witchcraft. And witchcraft gets people killed. It got her killed. Do you want to end up on that block? Keep your head down and do your duties. That is all." But Alara could not. The image of the glowing runes was burned into her mind, a puzzle she felt compelled to solve. Later, under the guise of delivering the evening meal to the few wretched souls still in the cells, she slipped away from her routine path. She returned to the damp wall beside the main gate. The greenish luminescence was gone, but the memory of the shapes was vivid. With a piece of charcoal stolen from the kitchen, she carefully sketched the symbols onto a scrap of parchment, her hand trembling not with fear, but with a thrilling sense of purpose. The next day, her quest began. She started in the castle library, a grand room filled with histories of battles and genealogies of the noble houses. But the runes she had copied matched nothing in those sanctioned texts. They were alien older. The royal librarian, a man more interested in cataloging the king's victories than in obscure symbols, shooed her away after a cursory glance. It was a scullery maid, an old woman with fingers gnarled from decades of work, who pointed her in the right direction. "The marks," the maid whispered, glancing furtively over her shoulder. "They look like the old writing. Before the king's line, before the great fire. The man you want is the silent priest. He minds the old scrolls, down in the archives below the chapel. But mind yourself, child. They say he's strange, and that place is not for the likes of us. The archives were not so much a room as a catacomb, a labyrinth of shelves carved directly into the bedrock beneath the castle chapel. The air was cold and smelled of dust, decay, and ancient vellum. Light was a rare commodity, provided by a few flickering oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows. It was a place of forgotten knowledge, a tomb for truths the kingdom had deemed inconvenient. And there, a large wooden desk piled high with crumbling scrolls, sat the silent priest. He was an old man, his back bent, his hair a wispy white halo around a bald pate. He did not look up as Alara approached, his entire being focused on the fragile manuscript before him. She cleared her throat. "Father," he continued his work, dipping his quill in ink with a hand that was surprisingly steady. I was told you know about old writing." Alara pressed on, her voice echoing slightly in the vast silence. She unfolded her charcoal-smeared parchment and placed it on the edge of his desk. "I found these by the dungeon gate, after the witch died." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the old priest's head turned. His eyes, a faded blue, blinked behind a pair of small spectacles. They dropped to the parchment, and then they widened. A tremor went through his entire body. He reached out a hand, not to take the parchment, but to hover over it, his fingers tracing the shapes in the air. His lips moved, soundlessly forming words. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry, raspy thing, and used and full of wonder. "Where?" he whispered, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. It was sharp, intelligent, and blazing with an intensity that made Alara take a step back. "Where did you see this? Tell me exactly." "On the stones," Alara said, her own heart beginning to race. They were glowing, just for a moment. What does it mean? The silent priest, whose name, she would learn, was Brother Aldous, leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He looked at Alara as if seeing her for the first time, assessing her. "It is the tongue of stone," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "The language of the land itself. A language the stone weavers, Morwenna's people, could read and write. It has been lost for generations, purged by the kings who feared it." He pointed a bony finger at one of the runes. "This one, it does not mean heir as in a person. It means the one who is to come from the foundation. And this," his finger moved to another, "means the awakening." She was not just predicting a birth. She was announcing an event, a geological coronation. Meanwhile, in the opulent solitude of her chambers, Queen Lyra was facing a different kind of terror. The king had been watching her. His glances were no longer those of a dismissive husband, but of a predator assessing a threat. The prophecy, "The true heir is born," had struck a chord of paranoid certainty in him. He knew she had visited the witch. He knew they had spoken. A midwife, secretly summoned and sworn to silence, had confirmed Lyra's secret. She was with child. The news that should have brought joy filled her with icy dread. This child, the promise of a future, was now a death sentence for them both if Valerius discovered it. Her handmaiden, a loyal woman, entered quietly. "Your Majesty," she murmured, her face pale. "The High Priest Caius has been asking questions among the servants. He wishes to know about your cycles, your health." Lyra's blood ran cold. Caius was a bloodhound, and he had caught the scent. Valerius' suspicion was being weaponized by the High Priest's ambition. She was trapped, a queen in a cage of gilded fear, carrying a child whose very existence was an act of treason. Back in the archives, Brother Aldous unrolled a massive, brittle scroll. It was a map of the kingdom, but unlike any Alara had ever seen. It showed not just cities and roads, but ley lines of power, sacred hills, and symbols identical to the ones she had copied, marking places of ancient, stone-bound energy. Morwenna was not just making a prophecy, Aldous murmured, his eyes alight with a scholar's fervor. She was activating one. Her blood on the stone, her death at the appointed hour, it was a catalyst. She has set something in motion, that cannot be stopped by an axe. He looked at Alara, his expression grave. The king and Caius believe they are hunting a person, but they are wrong. They are trying to fight the tide, and we must find the keystone before the entire foundation of this kingdom shifts. The hunt had begun. One woman sought to protect the future hidden within her. Another sought to understand the language of the stones, and both were racing against a clock ticking down towards an inquisition fueled by a king's paranoia. The stone which was gone, but her legacy was a key, and it had just been placed in the most unexpected of hands. What is the price of a secret kept for a lifetime? Can love, buried under years of silence and stone, truly be the key to saving a kingdom? Brother Aldous is about to confront a past he thought was dead, and the stakes have never been higher. Have you ever carried a secret that could change everything? Share your thoughts below. The air in the archives was thick enough to taste, a cocktail of dust and decaying secrets. In the pool of lamplight, Alara watched the transformation of Brother Aldous. The frail, silent archivist was gone, replaced by a man vibrating with a painful, long-suppressed intensity. His eyes, fixed on the runes she had brought, held a storm of memory. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You cannot understand. These marks, they are not just writing. They are her signature." "Whose?" Alara asked, though a cold certainty was already forming in her gut. "Morwenna's," he said, the name a sacred, tortured sigh. He slumped back into his chair, the weight of decades seeming to press down on him all at once. "I was not always a keeper of dead scrolls, child. Once I was a young scholar, sent to learn from the stone weavers in their mountain sanctuary. They were the memory of this land, the balance keepers." His gaze grew distant, lost in the ghost of a time before fear and fire. She was their leader, not with a crown, but with a quiet authority that came from the stone itself. Morwenna. She was brilliant, fierce. We worked together for years, translating texts older than this castle, and we loved. Alara's breath caught. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and incomprehensible, began to click into a picture of heartbreaking scale. The king's father, Valerius' sire, saw their knowledge not as wisdom, but as a threat. Aldous continued, his voice turning to gravel. He launched a purge. The sanctuary was burned. The weavers were hunted, scattered to the winds. I was recalled to the capital, my work deemed dangerous. I was told Morwenna had died in the flames. I believed it. For 50 years, I believed it. He looked at Alara, his eyes brimming with a grief so fresh it seemed to have happened yesterday. I buried my heart in these archives. I took a vow of silence for everything that truly mattered. "But she didn't die," Alara stated, the truth settling like a stone in her own chest. "No, she was captured, imprisoned, made a pet seer for the very dynasty that destroyed her people. And I was here, dusting the histories of her enemies, a few hundred feet below her cell." The self-loathing in his voice was palpable. "All this time, while our son grew up not knowing his mother, raised by others in secret, only to be lost to a border skirmish years ago. I lost them both." Alara thought of the prophecy. The true heir. She wasn't just speaking about a future king or queen. She was speaking of her own bloodline. "Your bloodline." Aldous nodded, a tear finally tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. The stone from which the heir would come. It was a double meaning. The foundation of the kingdom, and the lineage of the stone weavers itself. Our lost son. He had a child, a daughter, I was told, placed with a noble family in a distant province for her own safety after his death. Morwenna must have known. She must have spent a lifetime planning for this moment, using her captivity to position the pieces on the board. Her death was the final move, the sacrifice to activate the power in the stones and reveal the path. The revelation was a seismic shift. This was not a political coup. It was a reclamation. A resurrection of a legacy thought to be extinguished. "But the king and Caius," Alara urged, her mind racing. "They don't know any of this. They think the threat is from a rival noble or a foreign power. They're looking in the wrong direction. And that is our only advantage, Aldous said, wiping his face and squaring his shoulders. The scholar was gone, the strategist was emerging. But we are not the only ones in danger. High above, in the gilded cage of the royal wing, that danger was taking a concrete and terrifying form. Queen Lyra stood before King Valerius in his private council chamber. High Priest Caius stood just behind the king's shoulder, a vulture in priestly robes. "The rumors persist, my dear wife," Valerius said, his tone deceptively calm as he paced before her. He stopped, his eyes boring into her. "Whispers in the court, whispers from the square. They say the witch's prophecy of a birth was specific. They say you have been unwell, withdrawn." Lyra held her composure, a skill honed over years of marriage. "The execution of an old woman, even a witch, is a distressing spectacle, my lord. It is no wonder I am unwell, and the court will always whisper. It is what they do. It is what they do when given cause," Caius interjected, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "Your visits to the dungeon, in the dead of night, they were an unwise charity. One might wonder what assurances the witch gave you in return for your kindness." A cold knot tightened in Lyra's stomach. He knew. He might not have proof, but he knew enough to damn her. "I offered comfort to a dying soul, as any faithful person might," she replied, her voice steady, though her palms were slick with sweat. "Comfort," Valerius sneered, his patience snapping. "Or a conspiracy. Did you plot with her, Lyra? Did you let the hag plant her filthy, traitorous seed in my own house?" The crudeness of the accusation, so close to the truth, stole the breath from her lungs. She could not form a reply. Caius placed a hand on the king's arm, a gesture of false placation. "My king, let us not be hasty. The queen is delicate. Perhaps a period of quiet reflection is in order. A retreat to the summer palace, under the care of trusted physicians. They could determine the truth of her condition, for the health of the realm, of course." It was a sentence of house arrest, veiled in polite terms, and the trusted physicians would be Caius's own, who would not rest until they had either confirmed her pregnancy or bled the unclean spirit from her. It was a death warrant for a child, and likely for her. Lyra's mind raced, clutching at straws. She remembered Morwenna's final, whispered command, "Be brave." She lifted her chin, meeting the king's gaze with a defiance she did not feel. "I am your queen, not a broodmare to be inspected. I will not be sent away like a shameful secret. If you wish to know my health, ask your own court physician. But know this, Valerius," she said, putting all the conviction she could muster into her voice. "The only thing growing in this castle is your paranoia, and it will choke you long before any phantom heir." She turned and swept out of the room before her legs could buckle, the echo of her own audacity ringing in her ears. She had bought herself a day, perhaps two, no more. Back in the archives, Lyra and Aldous pored over the ancient map. The runes Morwenna had left were not just a message, they were a map within a map, pointing to a specific location deep within the castle's foundations, a place the scrolls called the Heartstone Chamber. "We must find it," Aldous said, his voice firm with a newfound purpose. "Morwenna's blood awakened the stones. Her runes are the directions. The heir, my granddaughter, is out there, but she is vulnerable. The power to protect her, to legitimize her claim not by sword but by the ancient law of this land, lies here, in the stone." He looked at Lyra, his eyes no longer those of a broken man, but of a grandfather fighting for his family's legacy. "The king hunts a person. Caius hunts for power. But we must find the heartbeat of the kingdom itself, before the king's fear and the priest's ambition tear it all apart." The race was no longer just about uncovering a secret. It was about reaching the living, breathing core of a prophecy before the forces of darkness could smother it, and the future queen in the cradle. Have you ever felt the world shift around you? Not a political shift, but something deeper, more fundamental? The stones of the castle are beginning to speak, and those who have the courage to listen are about to find out that the ground beneath their feet is not as solid as they believed. What would you do if the very walls started to whisper your name? Tell us in the comments. The silence that followed Morwenna's execution was a lie. It was not an absence of sound, but a holding of breath. And now, the kingdom began to exhale in ways that could no longer be ignored. It started subtly. A scullery maid, scrubbing the flagstones of the great hall, dropped her brush with a shriek, swearing the stone had grown warm and vibrated faintly beneath her palms. The guards on the night watch reported low, rhythmic hums emanating from the oldest sections of the outer wall, a sound like a giant's heartbeat heard through a pillow. In the royal chapel, during High Priest Caius's sermon condemning the lingering taint of witchcraft, a single, sharp crack echoed through the sanctum. A fissure, thin as a hair, had appeared in the marble base of the altar, snaking upwards like an accusing finger. King Valerius dismissed it all as hysteria and structural settling, but the people, superstitious and closer to the earth than their king, knew better. They whispered of the stone witch's curse, of a kingdom waking from a long slumber. The air itself grew thick with anticipation, charged with a static energy that made hairs stand on end. For Alara and Brother Aldous, hidden in their dusty sanctuary, these were not rumors, they were confirmations. The map was spread before them, the runes Morwenna had left now seeming to pulse with a light only they could perceive. The foundations, Aldous murmured, his finger tracing a path on the parchment that dipped below the known cellars. She's guiding us to the foundations. The Heartstone Chamber. It's said to be the nexus where the veins of the mountain converge. If her power is anywhere, it is there. The path was not on any official blueprint. It was a route described in metaphor and stone lore, a path for those who could read the signs. That night, with the castle gripped by an uneasy quiet, they made their move. Alara, with a knowledge of the servants' passages and unused corridors, led the way. Aldous, frail but fueled by a desperate purpose, followed. They descended far below the dungeons, into realms untouched by torchlight for centuries. The air grew cold and heavy, smelling of wet rock and immense age. The walls here were not cut stone, but the living bedrock of the mountain itself. And here, the signs Morwenna had left were no longer ethereal glows. They were physical. In the flickering light of their small lantern, they saw it. A section of the tunnel wall where the granite was smoother, almost polished. Carved into it, clear and undeniable, was the same set of runes Alara had seen by the dungeon gate. This is it, Aldous breathed, his voice full of awe. Her touch. She has been here, or her will has. He pressed his palm against the carving. It's warm. As his fingers traced the symbols, a deep, resonant hum seemed to answer from the stone around them. A single, low note that vibrated through the soles of their boots and up into their bones. A cascade of fine dust trickled from the ceiling. She's not just in the stones, Alara whispered, a shiver of primal fear and wonder running down her spine. She is the stones. Her death, it didn't scatter her. It distributed her. Aldous nodded, his eyes wide. Her consciousness, her will, woven into the very fabric of the castle. The prophecy isn't just in prediction. It's a spell she cast with her own life, and the kingdom is the crucible. Following the runic markers, they arrived at a dead end, a solid wall of seamless, black basalt. There was no handle, no keyhole, but in the center, etched with breathtaking precision, was a larger, more complex version of the sigil that had formed in Morwenna's blood on the execution square. What now? Alara asked, her hope faltering before the impassable stone. The key is not a physical object, Aldous said, understanding dawning on his face. It's a resonance. Her blood was the catalyst, but her lineage, my blood, is the tuning fork. He looked at his own aged, trembling hand. Our granddaughter is the true heir, but I am the bridge. He placed his palm firmly in the center of the sigil, over the symbol for foundation and awakening. He closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in memory. He thought of Morwenna, not as the frail witch in the cell, but as the vibrant, powerful woman from his youth. He poured all his grief, his love, his 50 years of silent fidelity into that touch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a deep, grinding groan echoed through the tunnel. a sound of continent shifting. The black basalt impossibly began to retract, not sideways like a door, but inwards and downwards, sinking into the floor like a massive key sliding into a lock, revealing a yawning, dark aperture. A wave of air, ancient and dry, sighed out from the darkness. It carried not the smell of decay, but of ozone and crushed granite, the scent of raw, immense power. From the darkness within, a soft, steady, amber light began to emanate. It pulsed in a slow, rhythmic beat, exactly like a resting heart. Alara and Aldous stood at the threshold, their faces illuminated by the otherworldly glow. They had found the heart of the prophecy. The question now was not if they dared to enter, but if they would survive what they found inside. The stone witch's final sanctuary awaited, and it was alive. When all doors are closed and hope seems lost, where do you turn? What if the very walls themselves became your allies? This is not a rebellion of swords, but of stone, and the most powerful magic is the one woven into the foundations of the world. If you could command the stone, what would you ask it to do? Let us know in the comments. The Heartstone Chamber was not a room built by hands, but a geode of cosmic proportions. The walls, ceiling, and floor were a continuous sheet of deep amethyst crystal, radiating the soft, pulsating amber light that had guided them in. In the center of the chamber, a pillar of raw, milky quartz thrust upwards from the floor, throbbing with the same steady rhythm. The very air hummed with a power so ancient and vast it made thought difficult. This was the nexus, the soul of the mountain, and woven through it, like golden threads in a tapestry, was the unmistakable presence of Morwenna. Brother Aldous fell to his knees, not in weakness, but in reverence, tears streaming freely down his face. "She's here," he choked out. "All around us." Alara could only stare, her rational mind struggling to comprehend the living geology around her. This was beyond witchcraft. This was the planet itself, and Morwenna had become its voice. Their moment of awe was shattered by the sound of distant, frantic bells from high above. The alarm. "They have Lyra," Alara said, the reality of their situation crashing back. "Caius and the king. They won't wait." Aldous rose, his face set with a grim determination. He approached the central quartz pillar. "Then we will not wait either. Morwenna did not bring us here to hide. She brought us here to act." He placed both hands on the pillar. The pulse quickened under his touch. The stones are awake. They listen, but they need a conductor, a focus. He turned to Alara, his eyes blazing with the reflected light of the crystals. "You have listened to the stones. You have a connection to her, one not of blood, but of spirit. I am the bridge of the past, but you, Alara, you can be the voice of the present. Help me." High above, in the Queen's chambers, the scenario was unfolding with terrifying speed. King Valerius, his face a mask of cold fury, watched as two of High Priest Caius's personal guards held Queen Lyra by her arms. A third man, the gaunt-faced royal physician, stood by with the leather roll of cruel-looking implements. The pregnancy must be confirmed, Caius insisted, his voice dripping with false concern, for the purity of the royal line. "If the child is tainted by the witch's influence, it cannot be allowed to live. It is a mercy, your majesty." "Let me go." Lyra struggled, her regal composure shattered into raw terror. "This is madness. I am your queen. You are a vessel of treason." Valerius roared. "I should have known your visits to that hag were more than charity. You let her poison you, poison my line." He nodded to the physician. "Do it." As the physician stepped forward, a low, deep groan echoed through the chamber. The floor trembled. A fine crack appeared in the marble mantelpiece. "What was that?" One of the guards muttered, his grip on Lyra loosening slightly. "An earthquake. Nothing more." Caius snapped, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Proceed." But it was not nothing. Deep in the Heartstone chamber, Alara stood beside Aldous, her own hands pressed against the warm crystal of the wall. She closed her eyes, pushing aside her fear, and did as Aldous instructed. She did not command. She asked. She remembered the stories Morwenna had told her in the dungeon, stories of the mountain's birth, of the rivers of power that flowed beneath them, of the patience of stone. She poured those memories, that understanding, into her touch, focusing on a single, desperate thought. Protect the queen. Stop them. The amber light in the chamber flared brightly. The hum intensified into a resonant chord that seemed to shake the universe. And the stone answered. In the queen's chamber, the tremor became a violent shake. The heavy oak door to the room, which the guard had barred, suddenly splintered with a sound like a thunderclap, but it did not fall outwards. It was as if an immense, invisible fist had punched it inwards, the solid wood exploding into 1,000 splinters. From the corridor outside, a grinding, screeching roar filled the air. The stone archway of the door began to contort, the lintel bending downwards, the jambs twisting inwards, sealing the entrance with a knot of solid granite. They were trapped. Witchcraft. Caius screamed, his eyes wide with panic. One of the guards, releasing Lyra, drew his sword and advanced towards the blocked entrance. As he did, the stone flags of the floor beneath his feet shifted. A single, sharp spike of granite shot upwards from between the stones, not to impale him, but to slam with brutal force into the hilt of his sword. The impact was so powerful it shattered the bones in his hand and sent the weapon clattering across the room. He fell back with a cry of agony. The second guard made a desperate lunge for Lyra, but before he could take 2 steps, the tapestry on the wall behind him came alive. The heavy iron rod from which it hung wrenched itself free from a stone wall, swinging around like a giant's club and striking him squarely in the back, sending him sprawling, unconscious. The physician dropped his tools and scrambled into a corner, gibbering in terror. King Valerius stood frozen, his face a parchment of disbelief and dawning, primal fear. He looked at the twisted stone of the doorway, at the groaning walls, at the spike that had risen from the floor. He was a king who commanded armies, but you cannot give orders to a mountain. Lyra, freed, stumbled back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the terror in her husband's eyes, the utter defeat in Caius's. And in that moment, she understood Morwenna's promise completely. This was not an attack. It was a defense. The kingdom itself was protecting its future. The stones had not risen in open war. They had not crushed the king where he stood. They had isolated the threat, disarmed the aggressors, and created a cage for the tyrants within their own palace. It was a display of power so absolute, so fundamentally other, that it stripped away all pretenses of authority. The grinding noise subsided, leaving only the panicked breaths of the men and the low, omnipresent hum that now seemed to emanate from every stone in the castle. The uprising was over. The stone had spoken its first, unequivocal warning. Lyra stood tall amidst the wreckage of her room, the last queen of a dying line, and the first hope of a new one. The path to the throne room was now clear. The final confrontation was no longer about seizing power, but about claiming a legacy that was already, irrevocably awake. What is the true mark of a ruler? Is it the crown they wear, or the legacy they weave into the very land? This is the end of one story, and the beginning of another. Where does power truly reside when the dust settles? Share your final thoughts on Morwenna's journey in the comments. The path from the ruined queen's chamber to the throne room was a pilgrimage through a transformed world. The castle was no longer silent. It was a symphony of stone. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the very air, a constant reminder of the awakened power. Torches flickered in their sconces as if in a steady wind, their light glinting off walls that now seemed to watch their passage. King Valerius, stripped of his guards and his confidence, was a broken man, prodded forward not by hands, but by the subtle, threatening shifts in the corridor itself. A stone that would jut out to block a retreat, a groaning archway that promised collapse if he strayed. High Priest Caius, in contrast, was a coil of furious, impotent rage. His prayers and curses were swallowed by the living granite around them. Queen Lyra walked between them, her back straight, her face a mask of serene authority that she had only ever pretended to feel before. She was the calm at the center of the geological storm. They entered the vast throne room. The courtiers and nobles who had gathered, drawn by the tremors and the rumors, fell into a terrified hush. Their eyes were not on their king, but on the queen who walked with the presence of a conqueror and on the stones that seemed to breathe around her. At the foot of the dais, waiting for them, stood Alara and Brother Aldous. They were no longer a jailer's daughter and a forgotten priest. They were the heralds. Valerius found a shred of his former bluster, his voice a ragged scream in the humming silence. "This is treason. Seize them. I am your king." No guard moved. They stood paralyzed, their loyalty outweighed by a primal, earth-deep fear. "You are a king of blood and fear." Aldous's voice rang out, clear and strong, amplified by the strange acoustics of the room. "But your time is over. The stone does not recognize your claim. It recognizes this." Valerius shrieked, drawing the jeweled dagger from his belt. With a final, desperate surge of fury, he lunged not at Lyra, but at Aldous. The bridge to the past, the key to the mystery. Lyra cried out, but she was too far away. Aldous stood his ground, his eyes closed, a sad smile on his lips. He was ready, but the stone was faster. As the king's arm descended, the marble of the dais itself erupted, not with violence, but with impossible grace. Two gigantic, sculpted hands of solid white marble shot up from the floor, as if a giant had been buried beneath the stone. They were crude, ancient, powerful. One hand closed around the king's wrist, stopping the dagger's plunge dead, the fingers of stone locking with the gentle, final sound of a crypt door closing. The other hand hovered, a shield of living rock. A collective gasp swept the room. This was no trick of the light. This was the kingdom itself, making its will known. And then a voice spoke. It was not from a single mouth, but from the walls, the floor, the very air. A chorus of whispers that coalesced into the unmistakable, rustling tone of Morwenna. "You seek to fight the tide with a dagger, Valerius. You see a rival in a man. But the threat to a rotten tree is not the storm, but the worm within. And the true heir is not a who, but a what? A truth that can no longer be buried." The marble hands held Valerius fast, a prisoner of the very throne he had murdered to possess. It was then that High Priest Caius saw his chance. In the chaos, he saw the unraveling of all his plans. And in a final, blasphemous act of ambition, he snatched a fallen guard sword. "The witch's magic dies with her bloodline," he screamed, and he thrust the blade not at the king, but at the exposed back of Brother Aldous. The steel found its mark. Aldous gasped, his eyes flying open in shock. He staggered forward, his lifeblood staining the stone at his feet. But as he fell, he did not look at Caius. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling, a look of peace on his face. "Morwenna," he whispered. The response was immediate and terrible. The floor beneath Caius's feet turned to liquid granite for a fleeting second, swallowing his feet to the ankles before solidifying again with the sound of grinding bones. He was trapped, anchored to the spot. Then, the stone arch above the main doorway cracked, and a cascade of rubble fell upon him, a tomb of his own making, silencing his screams forever. The throne room was utterly still, save for the ragged breathing of the dying king, held upright by the stone fist, and the soft weeping of Alara as she knelt by Aldous. Morwenna's voice filled the silence one last time, gentle now, and full of a love that had waited 50 years to be spoken. "The one who is to come from the foundation is here, not by the sword, but by the right of the stone, the blood of the weavers and the hope of the future, united." The amber light from deep below pulsed through the entire castle, a wave of pure, warm energy. It washed over Queen Lyra, and she felt a protective, ancient power settle around her and the child in her womb. It washed over the nobles, and they fell to their knees, not in fear, but in awe. The marble hands gently lowered the dying King Valerius to the ground, releasing him. He was already broken. The last sight of his stone prison was the final shard that shattered his mind. Lyra stepped onto the dais. She did not sit on the twisted, iron-wrought throne of the usurpers. She turned her back on it. She faced her people, her voice clear and strong, carrying the authority of the mountain. "This throne is a lie," she declared. "It was built on murder and fear. It ends now. The new reign will not be ruled from a chair of cold metal, but guided by the living heart of this land." It will be a reign of balance, a reign of stone. In the weeks that followed, the castle began to change. The oppressive, sharp-edged architecture of Valerius's line seemed to soften, the stones settling into a more harmonious, ancient alignment. The Heartstone Chamber, its purpose fulfilled, sealed itself once more, a secret heart beating in silence. Queen Lyra ruled as regent, her council guided by Alara, who became the keeper of the old ways, and the memory of a love that had outlasted tyranny and death. They prepared for the coming of the child, the true heir, born not just of a queen, but of a prophecy written in stone and sealed with a sacrifice. And in the quiet moments, Lyra would often place her hand on the sun-warmed stone of a balcony or the cool marble of a floor. And as she listened very closely, with her heart and not her ears, she could hear it, a faint, contented hum, the sound of a kingdom finally at peace, watched over by the patient, eternal presence of the stone which, and her lost love, forever woven into the foundation of all that was and all that would be. Thank you for watching. First of all, the stories we tell are either entirely fictional or inspired by real events. If you have any stories you'd like to share with us, let's chat in the comments section. If you liked our story, we'd appreciate it if you could like our video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on our next videos. You can check out the playlist created for other stories on our channel in the card section at the top right. See you in the next video.